Okay, so now we're going to go into more of the business aspect of health coaching. And I think this is always a really important thing to cover because we don't really discuss it a lot in our curriculum. And there is a section of your exam for the ACE Health Coach certification that will go over more of the business aspects. So it's important to kind of pay attention to because some of this stuff might be really new to you. So this first part of it is just understanding the professional commitments and considerations of an ACE health coach. And some of the learning outcomes include identifying social determinants of health, employing effective strategies to foster an inclusive coaching environment, discussing the importance of establishing and enforcing personal and professional boundaries in the client-coach relationship, applying best practices for documenting and safeguarding client information, and lastly, recognizing and appropriately responding to emergency and high-risk situations. So let's go ahead and start at the beginning. As a health coach, it's incredibly important that we are trying to provide services that offer an inclusive environment for all individuals. So as health coaches, we really have a unique opportunity to do this and to create an inclusive culture in practice so that we can be the drivers of population health and health equity. And so you might have heard this term health equity before. Health equity is the absence of avoidable or remedial differences among groups of people, and that could be based on their social background, based on their economic background, or even their geographic background, right? So essentially what we're trying to get with health equity is this middle picture. And so I liked this picture, and some of you have seen this before. And so sometimes when we talk about these things, sometimes people get confused between the terms equity and equality, because we say, well, we want to treat everyone equally. And while that is good, what you can see is sometimes because of where someone's starting in life, because of these kind of determinants of health, they may not be able to have the same experience if you treat them equally. So in the box on the left, you can see that they're all sitting or standing on the same size box, right? And so the assumption is that everyone benefits from the same support system. But what we know in health is that that's not the case because not everyone is starting from the same space because of these different social determinants of health. And so that's where equity is so important. And you can see in this picture that people are going to get different size boxes based on what they need. So everyone gets the support that they need, and this is a really important concept to understand. So as health coaches, we are trying to help pursue health equity for our population, for our communities, for our clients, okay? And then what's interesting about this picture too, and I don't want to ignore this, is that the idea of removing the barrier, right? So in this case, the fence, is what's actually called justice. And that's probably for another class, but I think it's important for us all to understand is that it's one thing to provide the stepping stools for equality. It's a whole other thing to provide the right amount of support or stepping stools for equity. But then the ultimate goal is to remove the barriers so that we can have justice for health, okay? So you heard me use the term determinants of health. And what I mean by that is that there, as a human being, there's a number of things that actually determine our health, right? And addressing those things is incredibly important to ultimately achieving health equity. Because we know that health status is impacted by many things beyond just health care. And so what we mean by determinants of health is that place matters. So where you grew up, where you work, where you worship, where you play, how old you are, all of those things matter. And why it matters is because we have these policies, and these environments around us, and really these systems that really impact our access and affordability of healthy behavior choices. And research has consistently identified that differences in health outcomes are associated with variations in populations regarding race, ethnicity, and income, and a lot of that has to do with these health disparities. So health disparities are differences in health outcomes that are closely linked to social, economic, and environmental disadvantage. So it's important that you understand this concept. And social determinants of health are structural determinants and conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, okay, how old they are, etc. Health coaches should move beyond a client's individual behavior and address social determinants in order to have the greatest impact on health and to increase the likelihood that a healthy lifestyle can be maintained. What's really challenging for most of us is that we do really, really well with the individual of trying to help the individual make their own changes. But what we forget is that individual is part of a system. And so while they might make one small change, they are in an environment and in a system that is basically helping them not make that change. Okay, and so for us to have the biggest difference on our clients' health behavior change, we need to think about it not just from this individual perspective, but from this kind of social determinant perspective. And so there are these 6 kind of primary different categories of social determinants of health. The first being economic stability, so things like whether they have a job, what is their income within that job, what are their expenses because of it, do they have to drive far for it, right? Are they in debt? The second social determinant of health category is neighborhood and physical environment. Are there parks nearby? Is it walkability? Are there sidewalks? What's the transportation look like? What does housing look like in their environment? The third category of social determinants of health is education. What's their literacy? What was their higher education like? What was their early education like? What language were they grew up speaking versus what they had to learn in school? The fourth category is food. Do they have access to healthy eating options? Are they constantly experiencing hunger? The fifth is community and social contexts. So what are the support systems that are around them that can aid in their behavior changes? What are some discrimination things that are around them that can inhibit their behavior changes? What about social integration and community engagement? And then lastly, it's healthcare system. And this is the last social determinant of health. And this includes things like what we think of like healthcare coverage, but it's also quality of care. Because what we know is that just because 2 people have the same coverage does not mean that they will have the same quality of care. And there's actually been a lot of research done with this and race, and I encourage you to look into that, okay? Other things include provider availability, linguistics, right? So if someone doesn't have a certain, if they don't speak a native English as a native language, it might be difficult for them to get access to healthcare. So these are all things that we need to think about because they are all part of this system. And ultimately, they lead to these health outcomes that we know aren't great. So mortality, morbidity. They can lead to decreased life expectancy, decreased health status, right? So now it's important to kind of shift that, right? And knowing how important all those social determinants are, it's important for us then as health coaches to have this certain level of cultural competence. And if you remember, cultural competence is this idea that we are trying to learn about a different culture and so that we can kind of see it through the lens of that culture, right? And it's important for a health coach to view each client through that lens of cultural competence. And remembering that just because someone has a similar background as another client or even yourself doesn't mean that they should or are going to experience life similarly. And so you might say, well, I'm a woman, and so I understand what it's like to be a woman in the health field. But first of all, that's only one of your identities. And secondly, just because you had this experience doesn't mean that other people have had that experience as well. So this is important for you to remember. We should never assume that all people with similar backgrounds are the same. Incredibly important that you remember that, okay? And then just the other thing is also to remember, and I mentioned this in a few slides or a few lectures ago, is that cultural competence is this idea, right, that we want to see the people and through the lens of them. But I think it's also important to strive to reach cultural competence, right? So cultural responsiveness is this idea that, yes, we want to have a better understanding of culture and ethnicity and language, but the difference between these two terms, right, is that responsiveness doesn't imply that we know everything and that we kind of reached perfect, right? Responsiveness implies that we're constantly working with the community to better understand what's going on with them, so we don't make assumptions. And so again, cultural competence almost sounds like you've reached this state. In fact, they have cultural competency kind of trainings, which basically says, okay, well, I went through this training and now I'm culturally competent. Well, the problem with that is that that's not likely the case, right? And that it's an ongoing process to work with those people, to understand what's going on with them, and really remembering that they are kind of the experts, right? So it's also important that we confront our personal bias. And we've actually talked a lot about bias in this class in different labs and a little bit in different lectures. And so you all know that as human beings, we all have these personal biases that exist. We have personal values and belief systems, and it's all based on our history, our background, and our culture, right? How were we raised, right? What was the environment we were raised in? So a health coach should assess and reflect on their own biases using a self-assessment tool. And so this is something that I want you all to do before you come into class for lab. You're going to click on that hyperlink that says Implicit Association Tests, IAT, and you're going to take at least 2 of them of your choice before lab. And you're going to see that there's the examples of age, weight, race, and disability, but there's a ton more of different implicit association tests. And this is all done through Harvard, and it's a big piece of research that I'm looking forward to doing here soon. But why this is important is that it highlights some implicit biases that might exist for some reason or another, right? We all have them, and that's important for us to understand, but we can't do anything about them until we know. And so this is something that I want you all to do before lab, and we will all kind of discuss in lab. We also have this tool that your book shows for different bias assessments. Now this is a little bit more explicit because you're answering explicitly about your thoughts on these things, but we'll go over this in lab as well, but I just wanted you all to see it in one space. So let's go ahead and pause here and do a quick little learning recap. First question, what's the difference between health equity and equality? And how does this apply to health coaches? Second question, what are the 6 categories of social determinants of health? And be prepared to have at least 1 or 2 examples of each. What does the term cultural competence or cultural relevance mean, or responsiveness? And how can you understand and confront your personal bias? We'll pause here, and I will see you for the next lecture.